Welcome to Embargoed, a podcast featuring intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I am one of your hosts, Brian Fleming. I am here, as always, with my friend, colleague, and co-host on the other side of the looking glass, post-inauguration, Mr. Tim O'Toole. What's going on, Tim?
What's going on, Brian? It is good to be post-inauguration. All of the National Guard troops appear to have been removed from Capitol Hill, so we're getting a little bit back to normal. My dogs miss them, but I'm not sure much else in the neighborhood does.
I was going to say they might be the only ones.
Right.
Welcome to Embargoed. We are very happy to be here, very happy that the United States is still a going concern. We're very happy, as Tim said, that the Capitol, things are a bit calmer on the Capitol than they were the last time we recorded. Thank you again for joining us here in late January, several days removed from the inauguration of President Biden. And not surprisingly, I think that is going to be our focus today. Um, Last time we obviously spent a few minutes reflecting on what had happened at the Capitol with the riots in early January. There has been, I think it's fair to say, there was a frantic amount of activity that occurred in the last 2 weeks of the Trump administration pre-transition. So that is what we're going to focus on today, is taking stock of many of those actions and trying to make sense of it and figure out what was symbolic, what is real, what may stay, what may go, broader impacts, etc. So that's going to be our focus today. Let me just dispense with all the normal introductory notes. So we're not giving legal advice. We're not discussing any confidential information. All opinions are mine and Tim's. So if you don't like what we're saying, blame us. Don't blame anyone else. And as always, if you're a fan of the pod, please subscribe. You can catch us anywhere: Apple, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, Overcast, YouTube. Please give us a rating if you're a fan, 5-star rating, hopefully. And spread the word. 2021 embargoed, back for year two. And again, it is a new day in many ways, and we, I think, are relieved, as many are, for that. So that is really what we're going to focus on today. So we have a lot to cover. We're going to do this lightning round style essentially because I think many of these topics we're going to come back to at some point. Many of them are, I wouldn't say they're more than gestures. They are actions that were taken, but it's unclear sort of what the legal or policy implications of these are long term. So we're gonna comment on them a bit and then sort of move on. Lots to cover. So the roadmap here is as follows. We are, as I said, gonna kind of run through a catalog of what just happened over the last couple of weeks, which was a lot. And I think even more so, I lived through the Obama to Trump transition when I was still in government. And there was a lot happening in December, January of 2016 into 2017. But I think nothing compared to what we just saw the last several weeks. And as a theme that Tim and I have been discussing pretty regularly over the last few months is the idea that the outgoing administration was going to try to tie the hands of the incoming administration with respect to critical policy issues. And I think that is exactly what we saw, lots of attempts to do that. And so that's a lot of what we're going to talk about in the next hour or so. So the roadmap is, and I won't get into too much detail because we're covering a lot of topics, but we're going to start with Cuba. Not starting with China. Then we will hit a couple of China topics. We'll swing through Iran and Russia. We're going to go take a look at Yemen. We don't talk about Yemen very often, but some pretty consequential stuff just happened with respect to Yemen in the past couple of weeks. And then we're going to wrap up with some more China and then a couple of sort of more generally applicable actions that were taken. And so before we get started, Tim, any thoughts before we kick off here and run through our lightning round recap of the final frantic couple of weeks of the Trump administration?
So I'm feeling optimistic. And
You
the
are a pretty
national.
optimistic guy by
I
nature, I would say.
I
So
am, but I'm particularly optimistic now, in part because this agenda that you just laid out has lots of different parts to it. and they're not all China. And I do think that in the coming years, we're going to see sanctions used as a much more um, a much more discrete tool to go after particular issues and not just kind of a hammer with every problem being the nail, particularly when it comes to China. I think we'll probably see much more nuance when it comes to China in the coming years, and much more use of sanctions outside of China with respect to particular issues. And so I'm glad that we're expanding the map this time, and I think that that's probably a sign of things to come. I also did want to circle back to the National Guard. We were very happy that they provided the protection that they did, but very sad that they had to be here to do that because it really was a strange time in U.S. history, and I hope we don't see it again.
Agreed. Indeed. So with that, we will pause for our favorite sound effect, and we will kick off our lightning round recap episode of the, again, frantic final weeks of the Trump administration. So two quick introductory notes here before we get into substance. So number one, there's a lot we're leaving out. There was too much that happened in the last few weeks. We're not going to cover everything. This would be like a 4-hour show if we tried to do that. So there's many things we're leaving out. There were many designations. There were entity list additions. There were all kinds of things happening at sort of a more granular level that we're not going to cover. New rules. We're going to touch on one or two, but not a ton of them. So most of these are sort of bigger picture, bigger swings, so to speak, that were taken here sort of at the end of the administration. We're trying to decipher what this all means and think with looking forward what this will all mean. The second thing is on inauguration day, as is custom when there is a change in power in the White House, there was what's known as a regulatory freeze memorandum that was issued by the White House, by the Chief of Staff of the White House, and the President's Chief of Staff, and that essentially says to all executive branch agencies, put your pencils down. It's a little more particular than that. It's talking about rules that are about to be published in the Federal Register that might have just been published, that have not yet had a full effective date come and go. It basically, this is very broad strokes, but it basically says, hey, everybody should pause and consider before anything is further implemented. And in particular, you should pause if you don't have a presidentially appointed agency head or department head in place yet. And so the cabinet is starting to be filled out. I believe Janet Yellen's probably going to be confirmed today. I think Tony Blinken at the State Department is probably going to be confirmed this week. There are more coming, so that will be coming soon. But for now, we're in a bit of a limbo period, so there is a lot of gray area here, and not everything we're talking about falls within the memo. But just keep that in mind for context. That some of these things potentially are impacted, at least indirectly, if not directly. And then more broadly, this is a true period of transition where I think everything is up for reevaluation. So
So much stuff happening. I mean, it was really hard to keep up just by
yeah,
email with all the stuff coming in, much less actually pay attention to it. So
yeah.
I
It
don't
was
envy the new administration. They're going to
right.
have a lot on their plate to review
It
just from the last few weeks.
it was an avalanche of stuff to go through. So without further ado, let's get right to it, and we're gonna try to whip through these pretty efficiently. So number one, let's start with Cuba. So on January 12th, the State Department Secretary, outgoing, now former Secretary Pompeo, announced that Cuba was being added once again to the state sponsors of terror list. This is something that the Obama administration had undone. They had delisted Cuba it was now 5 years ago. I think it was 2015 when that happened, in an attempt to normalize relations with Cuba. And obviously, we've discussed a great deal, all of the efforts that were made by the Trump administration to essentially unwind all of the relaxation of Cuba sanctions and other Cuba-related measures that the Obama administration took. So this happened again with barely a week left in the administration. Many obviously, I think, see this as so. It's interesting because I think as we've said, there's always going to be people in the U.S. and in particular, especially on the Republican side of the aisle and the Cuban expat community, who are going to applaud sort of any harsh measures that are directed toward Cuba. But I think there are many who saw this as a bit of a cynical ploy by the State Department to, again, tie the hands of the incoming administration. The justification itself of why they were being re-added to the list was, quite frankly, pretty thin when it comes to how they were actually, supporting how the state of Cuba is supporting terrorism. And I think it's pretty clear the seems aimed at slowing the normalization of relations with Cuba, as Biden has indicated he wants to do. He wants to go back to some of the sort of Obama era course of potentially opening things up with Cuba again. And I will say that obviously there's not necessarily any long-term impediment to that happen, but I think this does, as a practical matter, slow things down considerably. To take one sort of recent example that's illustrative here, Sudan actually just came off the state sponsor of terror list at the end of last year. And that was sort of a long time coming because OFAC sanctions had been relaxed with respect to Sudan in 2017, and it was just at the end of last year that they came off. And now there have been some accompanying changes that have been made by BIS relating to export controls and other things. So, in terms of the practical impact of this, how will this affect the way that people in the U.S. or outside of the U.S. interact with Cuba? I don't know that it will have much, but certainly with respect to normalizing relations with Cuba for the new administration, it's just another hurdle. I don't, Tim, your
Yeah,
your thoughts on that?
I don't have much to add on that other than to say, I it is a big deal to add a country to the list of countries supporting terrorism. It
There's only
has
four. There's
there's
only
only
four
four,
right now.
and that's now, right? I mean, there were only three
There were
going in.
three 2 weeks ago. There were only three. Yeah.
Right. And I think part of the reason for that is that because it is so consequential to add a country to to that list because it really affects not only what the U.S. can do, but what countries around the world can do with the listed country. That it's generally been a very considered decision, and there's been a lot of evidence before a country goes on. Just in the same way, I mean, I will note that when President Obama took Cuba off, he actually didn't do it as part of the agreement with Cuba that started kind of the loosening. The agreement actually allowed for a study period, and again, it was, I think people thought it was a foregone conclusion, but I think people thought it was a foregone conclusion then because there really hadn't been much evidence for a long time that Cuba had been engaging in support of terrorism. And so the foregone conclusion was we're going to study it, but unless we find some evidence, we're going to take them off the list. Here, it just, as you said, the reasons given were so slim. And, whatever else you think of Cuba, supporting global terrorism is not really what they appear to be engaged in. And so it just does make the whole process seem more political and for that reason less trustworthy than it had been. Now, there's so much happened at the end of the Trump administration that will be brought into question that I'm not sure this is going to get a high profile, but it was, I think, both disappointing, but I also don't expect it to last long.
Yeah, there is gonna have to be there's a formal review process and there's congressional notification. There's all kinds of kind of hoops you have to jump through to do this if they're going to take them back off. But again, I don't know. Yeah, it's just in the priority structure. How high a priority is this going to be? It's just another perhaps again delay uh, to possibly putting things back on a track to loosening or normalizing relations with Cuba, whereas otherwise perhaps the incoming administration would have moved a little more rapidly in that regard. So we'll keep an eye on that. But again, I think from a practical perspective, there are certainly some kind of peripheral consequences. And as Tim said, I think it makes, to the extent that there was comfort perhaps in dealing with Cuba, at least outside of the U.S., around the world, perhaps this takes away some of that comfort and perhaps heightens the risk that people will perceive in dealing with Cuba. But it was already in a pretty risky bucket to begin with heavy restrictions, and so I think it's not a material
Yeah.
change probably in that regard. So
Right. From a sanctions perspective, it doesn't make much
yeah,
difference. But
yeah. So with that, let's pivot to number two, and let's do our first China topic.
so the first China topic is the pronouncement from the outgoing Trump administration that China is committing genocide with respect to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province. And again, I mean, this was an announcement that you know, in terms of immediate consequence, it's probably somewhat limited, particularly from a sanctions perspective, since there already is a Xinjiang province, or there are sanctions with respect to what's happening to the Uyghurs. There's an entire program. There's also the global Magnitsky sanctions, and that have been used to deal with what's happening in Xinjiang province. So from a sanctions perspective, probably not a huge change, but it was a final poke in the eye to China on the way out. Certainly is not going to help the Biden administration in terms of improving relations. This is one that I don't think that on either side of the aisle there's a lot of controversy with respect to the view that what China is doing with respect to the Uyghurs uh, is appalling and potentially genocide. Um, but this is an example of why they call it diplomacy, and why when you speak carefully and try not to offend people, that is called diplomacy. That it is, China is a big country. They're a very powerful country, and labeling something genocide has consequences in the international proceedings. It has consequences from a human rights and a respect standpoint. And China is, whatever it's doing in Xinjiang is unlikely to be changed by this, but its behavior towards the United States is not likely to get better based on this announcement. And so, you know, obviously, I'm not in favor of holding back and hiding when genocide is happening and being scared to call it genocide, but you also want to try and make sure that if you're going to do that, that you will get some good consequences from it. And it's not clear to me what those consequences are going to be.
Yeah, I think just a couple of quick follow-on points on that. I think this is just clearly, and there's going to be a common theme when everything we talk about with China. This is just clearly a move, was clearly a move to just antagonize China and I mean, this is about as provocative a public pronouncement as the United States government could make with respect to China. And it is not, as Tim said, it's not inconsistent with the views of President Biden or incoming Secretary of State Blinken, who are both on the record as having essentially agreed with this assessment. And if anything, it's again, it seems a bit cynical in part because, if John Bolton's memoir is to be believed, President Trump was telling Xi Jinping that it was what they were doing with the Uyghurs was exactly correct, and that it was a good job, and it's exactly what I would do. And now here on the, literally on the final day, there's a 180-degree about face and a condemnation of the harshest sort. And so that I think is that I think is not lost on on the Chinese and on many others here. So, but I think to Tim's point, one final thought that I would have here is that the statement that the secretary released sort of called on China to immediately release all prisoners in Xinjiang province, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, etc. That's obviously not going to happen. But what is also being signaled there, I think, and perhaps what the new administration could actually leverage and take to their advantage is the idea that maybe this, along with some of the other things we're going to talk about, is a first step toward actually building some multilateral international pressure on China to perhaps get some kind of change in behavior. Because I think with, to date, understandably, just about everybody other than the US has been just totally silent with respect to what's happening in Xinjiang, what's happening in Hong Kong, what's happening in other sort of facets of, Chinese society right now with crackdowns and other, potential human rights and anti-democratic practices. And this, I think, it was sort of styled as it was to try to attract perhaps more get some people on board to sort of push this cause. And I mean, there was, again, in the statement, they're equating this to Nazi concentration camps and some of the darkest stuff that's ever happened in modern history, and that's no accident. And whether you sort of approve of that language or think it's sort of accurate or not, that's I think what certainly what they were going for. And again, initial indications are that the incoming administration's not necessarily going to back away from that. I don't know that they will perhaps play it up in the same way to poke China in the eye so vehemently, so vigorously, but I think it will be something that they will perhaps keep in their back pocket and maybe actually be able to use for some positive effect.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see what happens. I will kind of just note in passing that the idea that the Trump administration's one of their last acts was to protect Muslim minorities from discrimination seems a little bit out of character with the way that the Trump administration came into office, and so I think that that's probably part of the reason that they have not. This has not been viewed as an action um, that is really directed towards concern for human rights violations against Muslims, but more concerned for um, poking China in the eye on the way out. But we'll see. Again, that doesn't mean that there wasn't some merit
Right.
to what they were saying. The messenger was a little bit odd.
Right. Just because you question the motives of the messenger doesn't necessarily water down the truth of the message. But and to pivot to our next topic, I think the same would apply here, which is number three. We're going to talk about Hong Kong. So in a very odd coincidence, on the same day that the Capitol riots broke out again, as has been widely reported, alleged, and now being considered by the United States Senate, incited by President Trump himself, there were widespread arrests in Hong Kong of politicians and Democratic uh, protesters and sort of this sort of Hong Kong resistance element. And so there was. This is very much in line with what we've seen already now under the national security law there, and what people sort of feared would be coming when China passed the national security law last year. And there were a smattering of designations that came out a few days after this under EO 13936, which was, of course, put out when we discussed at length a few months ago, targeting these anti-democratic, repressive practices in Hong Kong. There was a joint statement made, again, to talk about multilateralism. There was a joint statement made between the US, Canada, Australia, and the UK, sort of condemning what the authorities were doing in Hong Kong with respect to these re- sort of opposition politicians and democratic protesters and leaders. And so I think the only comment here really is, again, given now that we have an administration that is, again, in much the same way that just with the Uyghurs, we have an administration coming in that I think is going to, by all accounts and by all indications, going to take sort of human rights sort of seriously for its own worth, and not necessarily as a convenient kind of policy chip or bargaining chip. Are we going to see more aggressive tactics with respect to Hong Kong, or are we going to see different tactics with respect to Hong Kong and the sanctions and authorities that are already there? And again, the big question is what type of prospects are there for getting any kind of multilateral support for the U.S. approach, which the U.S. was sort of first out of the box with, to take a swing at China for its what it was doing in Hong Kong and the national security law. Is anybody else going to get on board? I mean, public statement with some of our closest allies, that's nice, but what does that really mean at the end of the day? So, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is another area. It's a lot like the Uyghurs, where they're not necessarily wrong in terms of what they're saying, but the messenger itself is one where, um, when you express concern for human rights, it's kind of hard to say, we're concerned when our enemies engage in human rights violations, but we're totally fine with it when we do it or when our friends do it. And so it doesn't, the message just doesn't resonate as strongly. that said, what's happening in Hong Kong is very troubling, and I think the Biden administration it's an issue that the Biden administration is going to need to deal with. We've talked in prior episodes about how I'm not convinced that sanctions is the way to go when it comes to China, because when you've got a country that big, sanctions are not a very powerful tool. They're certainly one to have in your toolkit, but this is an issue that I think goes a lot further through diplomatic means and sanctions as a last resort rather than sanctions as a first resort with no diplomacy going on at all.
Right. And I think that would be much more consistent with what the approach we would expect to see from this administration is that we again, this may be a ways off. There's going to be a lot of, I think, there's going to be a feeling out period here in these initial months with China. There's a lot of, we haven't even talked about the Chinese blocking statute, which we're not going to really have time to get into on this episode, but that's another big issue that's kind of coming back, aimed back at the U.S. By the way, a number of sanctions levied against U.S. officials on the last day or the first day of the Biden administration as a nice parting shot by China. As again, the U.S. officials largely sort of shrugged that off as symbolic, but nevertheless, there's a lot more to sort of unpack there, and this is going to be a key thread, and so we're going to keep watching, and I agree with Tim that sanctions first might not be the policy of the new administration. So we'll see what happens. That being said, the tool is there. If sort of perpetrators and others are known to have been behind things, then I wouldn't be surprised if we continue to see kind of a steady drumbeat of designations going forward. So with that, let's pivot away from China. We will come back to China, but we're trying not to do half an hour straight of China today. So let's go back. Let's go to Iran and check in with Iran and see what happened in the waning weeks here with Iran.
I mean, it seems like every 20 minutes you'd get another email from OFAC sanctioning somebody else in Iran. I mean, I think they were down to the to the very bitter end looking for unsanctioned entities in Iran that they could add to the sanctions list. And it just this one, unlike some of the other actions where, with respect to the Uyghurs and with respect to Hong Kong, there is some there in terms of the underlying foreign policy dispute. And certainly there is some there with respect to the general foreign policy positions of the US and Iran being relatively antagonistic. So I'm not saying, there's nothing about what the Iranian government is doing that would warrant sanctions. But what I am saying is these don't seem motivated by any new behavior by Iran or by any kind of, classic sanctions policy at all. These new designations look even more than the others, like an attempt to build up as many hurdles as possible to diplomatic action by the Biden administration with respect to reinstituting the nuclear deal. And on
Yeah,
that
I think.
point, yeah, go
Oh,
ahead. No,
sorry, go
please
ahead.
go
No,
ahead.
I was gonna say, yeah, I think the die was really cast on this a few months ago when it was clear that there would be no second Trump, there would be no 2.0 Trump term, and they took some actions in the fall that we discussed and in the early part of the winter, and now this is just more of the same. I totally agree. There was one set of designations that were targeted at foundations affiliated with the Supreme Leader, which is, a little bit of a more provocative, another poke in the eye, if you will, sort of targeted at the highest levels to perhaps leave an even more bitter taste in the mouth of the Iranian leadership to prevent perhaps ever sitting back down with the U.S. or the JCPOA, the other JCPOA parties to try to get back into a nuclear deal. But I agree. I think this was just sort of just spinning out the same type of actions that we've seen for months and years now targeting Iran.
Yeah, I mean the one thing that I was going to add to this is that it does create a huge level of complexity in terms of re-entering the nuclear deal because as we know at the time of the nuclear deal, one aspect of that deal was removing a bunch of SDNs, and I'm sure you know better than me, each SDN removal was the subject of likely extensive negotiation, and and there were hundreds of them at the time of the JCPOA that were removed. Now, one impediment to re-entering the nuclear deal is to take all of the designations that occurred over the past few months and find out which ones are were made for reasons that were serious enough that you wouldn't remove them as part of entering in back into the JCPOA. So you got to go through each one of these SDN designations and decide was it a real designation made for terrorism reasons that we really this entity is one that even if we do re-enter the nuclear deal that we're going to fight to keep on the SDN list, or do you just remove them all, which I don't think you can. I think and so to the extent that the Biden administration is still invested in getting back into the nuclear deal, and I noted that the president's press secretary in her first press conference reiterated that the administration is committed to that, and that in its discussions with its European allies, it expected the European allies to bring that up as a priority for Europe. And so if they're doing that, this really does create meaningful hurdles to going back into the nuclear deal because every designation over the last few months is a lot more work because it's not just a matter of kind of stripping them all off the list. You've got to figure out who stays and who goes. And if you figure out that you want some to stay, that's going to create an additional negotiation with Iran if they decide that, well, no, their position is that we should go back to exactly the SDN list that existed at the time of the nuclear deal and nothing more. And so I don't think you should underestimate what they're doing in terms of creating hurdles. These are real hurdles.
Yeah, I don't. So my just last thought on this is I wouldn't say that anything that happened in the last few weeks with respect to Iran creates any kind of real structural impediment. We all know that there is going to be a lot of things have to align if there's going to be re-engagement and some kind of a JCPOA plus that gets negotiated. We talked about this at length on a prior episode. I agree with you though completely that this is just sort of lengthening perhaps it's heightening the difficulty, lengthening the time period that would likely be necessary or to be able to work out all of the details that you would need to work out in order to even have a framework of some kind of a deal, in place. And so, to the extent that they have made it harder, the outgoing administration has made it harder. I think they probably have. Have they made it impossible? I don't think they have. And again, if the Biden administration is signaling very clearly that to European partners and to Iran itself, quite frankly, that it does want to reengage, then I think that is certainly on the table. It may take some time, but I think that is certainly on the table still.
Yeah, it is going to be and time is of the essence because there's an election coming up in Iran in only a few months now at this point, and if there's going to be a new JCPOA, it's likely going to have to happen in advance of that election.
Yeah, which seems hard to imagine that that's going
Yeah.
to happen in the next 6 months. So anyway, let's pivot away from Iran. Let's go back to one of our favorite topics, which we have been, I think, in some ways eagerly awaiting talking about more because it's one that we spend a lot of time thinking about and have spent a lot of time thinking about and talking about the last few years, which is Russia. And so uh, I want to. So for those who are not following this, which I presume most are, there was a pretty significant event that has now happened just recently, which is the Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny returned to Russia after, recall, we discussed this last year when he was poisoned, and there was some talk of sanctions targeting Putin and others around the poisoning and presumed role that the Russian leadership played in that. And he returned to Russia and was promptly imprisoned and has now set off a wave of protests across the country. He's been encouraging his supporters to take to the streets and protest. There were violent crackdowns on those protests this past weekend, not surprisingly. And so it's unclear sort of how that's all going to play out, whether or not this is going to have any lasting impact. But it seems now more than even at the time he was poisoned, it seems certainly in the EU, there is more outrage about what is going on and more, it seems, willingness at least being discussed again within EU Parliament. I've seen news reports from a variety of EU countries suggesting that top leadership is in favor of sanctioning Putin and others responsible for Navalny's imprisonment. And I think also importantly, there's some revived talk perhaps of taking some stand or some final steps to try to prevent Nord Stream 2 from being completed as a result as well, because as we've said in the past, this is an area and a topic that where there's just a lot of diverging thought on this between the U.S. and its allies, especially Germany. But it seems from what's being reported, at least, that there might now be more willingness to try to use that as a stick here and try to stop the final phase of Nord Stream 2 from proceeding. I should also add that, uh, as we have been saying, we fully anticipate, and all indications, with public statements are that the new administration, if there's going to be anyone that they are going to go after more harshly with sanctions, it's Russia. And we already saw at the very end of the prior administration, the very last day, we saw the I think it was the very first sanctions under Section 232 of CATSA targeting one Russian entity and a vessel related to Nord Stream 2 activities and pipeline activities. And then we know big issues for the incoming administration: Russian election interference in the most recent election. We're not talking about 2016, we're talking about last year, and the massive cyber intrusion of solar winds that resulted in state and local governments, state and federal government agencies all over the place being infiltrated and it has now been attributed to Russia. And so presumably there is more coming on that, and with the various sanctions tools available, the cyber EO, the election interference EO, other things, those will be sanctions related. And I would not be surprised if those are some of the first things we see from this administration in terms of kind of bold sanctions action. So a lot going on there. A few kind of final salvos from the old regime, and then it sort of, I think, tease things up for the new administration to really tack hard toward Russia. So what are your thoughts on that?
I predict that in 2021, we will talk about Russia on this podcast more than we talk about China. And
Wow, bold,
it's very
bold.
bold, but the reason the stars are aligned, and what I mean by that is, on the one hand, you do have Russia is kind of a more compelling target for sanctions than China is, because the economy is smaller and there are various pressure points that you can put on it that exist that China doesn't really have, because its economy is so much bigger and so much less connected to the West than Russia is. Second, I think you're going to have a lot more multilateral consensus about trying to stop Russian aggression. One area where there's not consensus is the Nord Stream pipeline, but even there you have large consensus except for Germany, and at least when Navalny was poisoned originally, Germany was even talking about sanctions and not finishing the Nord Stream pipeline. So I think there's going to be a lot of consensus from a multinational perspective as to new sanctions for China or for Russia, and based on all of those actions that you talked about, not just the human rights issues with respect to Navalny, but the fact that we had the biggest cyber attack in U.S. history at the U.S. government, and that it was attributed to Russia, and that is like a page 4 story at this point, tells you how much craziness was going on in the past few weeks. But it will come back.
Yeah.
That unlike a lot of these issues, I thought the attack on the Capitol was a real big issue that will live beyond 2021. But I think the cyber attack is as well, and the election interference is as well. And those are that sort of behavior is exactly the type of conduct that sanctions were designed to go after. So I think Russia sanctions, multilateral, and even bipartisan. I mean, that's the other thing about Russia, is that the Trump administration was kind of an island unto itself when it came to Russia, where it really, for whatever reason, didn't seem to want to go after Russia aggressively with sanctions. But the Republican Party and most of the Republican Senate felt very differently, which is why we have CATSA. And the Democrats, if anything, are even more Russia hawks than the Republicans on these issues. So I just think from a you know from a partisan perspective, from an international perspective, and just from a pure conduct and the efficacy of sanctions perspective, Russia is a much better target and a much more likely target for the next year.
Yeah, I totally agree on the cyber intrusion. I mean, that is the full scope and scale and damage on that is just barely beginning to be understood right now. And so there's going to be a lot more on that in the coming months. And I agree completely that we're going to hear, I think there's going to be a lot more Russia in the news this year under this administration. So yeah, we'll turn back in December to see if you're right that we did more Russia versus China this year, but that may or may not be true. I'm still skeptical. I think there's still going to be a lot of China, but yeah, I think it's a fair I think it's a fair prognostication. We shall see. So with that, let's turn to a country where I'm fairly confident will not be the number one topic on embargo this year, which is Yemen. But we do have a pretty notable development in Yemen that we do want to cover.
I think we have consensus that Yemen will not be
Well,
the lead story on embargoed in
no,
2021, but
I don't
it
think it
is a
will be.
story
Yeah.
now. And again, this was more um, of the Trump administration on its way out doing things to kind of placate friends and antagonize enemies. And the Houthis are viewed as a one side of the civil war in Yemen, but also as the Iran proxy side. And so I think part of the Yemen designation of the Houthis, which is one side of what is in essence, at least in part of Yemen, the functional government, is you need to understand that to understand where these sanctions are coming from. The administration on the way out put the Houthis onto the foreign terrorist organization list, and specifically it was a Houthi group called Ansarallah, which is the name of the group that was designated. Now, to their credit, at the same time that they did put the Houthis onto the FTO and the SDGT list, they also issued a number of general licenses that allowed for interaction with Ansarallah in Yemen, certainly with NGOs are allowed to interact. There's a humanitarian exception in terms of interaction, and that was a big deal. I think I mentioned to you right before we started taping that I actually have had some questions related to the designation come up, and the general licenses have answered those questions, in part because that's really, from the West perspective, it's kind of humanitarian aid and working with non-governmental organizations that is really the activity that's going on. And these general licenses are pretty broad in the sense that they mention Ansarallah and transactions with Ansarallah and allow most of these transactions to continue to go on. So I think it was certainly a symbolic issue in terms of kind of punishing the Iranian side of the Yemeni civil war, but to OFAC's credit, that they did, at least on the surface, seem to exempt out most of the transactions, that the humanitarian transactions that had been taking place, both before and after the designation.
Yeah, I do think you're exactly right that mostly this is I mean sadly this is a lot about Iran and not as much about Yemen and the population of Yemen who's suffering through the civil war there. Couple quick things to note. One is incoming Secretary of State Blinken has already said, I think said during his confirmation hearing, yeah, we're gonna review this. We're going to review this. This will be a priority to review this, and the implication is that this is probably going to be undone. Again, there will be hoops to jump through. It won't happen overnight, but this will, in all likelihood, be undone. And the clear message is that this just seems, from the incoming administration or the current administration's perspective, just to be very counterproductive. And again, just kind of a needlessly antagonistic move. In particular, not just for the humanitarian aspect of this, which Tim already covered, but to the extent that there was a hope to perhaps broker peace talks or figure out a way to bring the conflict to an end in Yemen, this just makes it that much more difficult. And so if these labels designations were to be removed, that might pave the path toward actually being able to broker some kind of a peace in Yemen and without sort of reassessing this move, it'll just be that much more difficult. So again, it is this is about as clear a clear an example of let's tie the hands and make it more difficult for the incoming for the new guys to do what they want to do here and I think there's also been related to that also is the fact that it's been made very clear from the new administration that they are no longer going to be pledging support to the Saudi efforts to try to sort of intervene in the conflict, and they're going to sort of walk away from that prior position. And so again, I think diplomacy is the way forward here. It seems that's clearly I think what the U.S. current U.S. administration wants, but and now it's just a couple of additional hurdles and likely additional time to sort of undo what just happened literally on just hours before the Trump administration was leaving town.
And just to be clear about this, because it's kind of been a theme so far of this episode, it's not unusual for an administration to try and lock in some of its policies on the way out. What I view as unusual, at least in the sanctions context, is kind of all of these actions that don't seem designed to lock in particular policies, but just seem designed to make life more difficult for the incoming administration. And so like they don't seem to have a particular purpose other than complexity. I will carve out the nuclear deal from that because I do think that the administration had a policy that they didn't want the nuclear deal. And so throwing up barriers to getting out of the nuclear deal, I don't think is unique to the Trump administration. But some of these actions, and particularly this one, just seem to accomplish nothing other than to just create more items on the to-do list for the Biden administration to undo.
Right, or to just sort of plainly try to antagonize certain, adversaries, foreign adversaries, or to curry favor with perhaps, certain countries. So yeah, Tim is right. This is not completely unprecedented. This always happens to some degree at the end of it, when there's a party change in the White House. But I think the degree to which we saw it, and also as reported it seems much of this was happening without the president's actual involvement. It was the Secretary of State who was mostly making these decisions. It seems somewhat unilaterally, or perhaps after having a bit of a power struggle at the cabinet level on some of these decisions. And these are things that had been kind of simmering for a long time. And in the last couple of weeks, it just seems. And again, this is as has been reported in multiple media outlets. He just made some decisions about things he was going to do, and just went ahead and did them. So that is certainly a little unusual. But in any event, so let's move forward. Now we're going to tack back to China. We're going to take it home with China. We have three topics left. The next one is we're back to communist Chinese military companies and the executive order targeting publicly traded securities. So this is one we've obviously talked about quite a bit already. So since our last episode was recorded, there was an amended executive order that attempted to clear up a couple of aspects of the original executive order, and they mostly were targeting the divestment rules and also the scope of what constitutes a transaction, as well as a few other things. What has become very clear now, based on that action, related FAQs that have been issued, and questions that we have gotten from clients and discussions that we have been part of with across the broader trade nerd community, is that this one really is a head scratcher. I think we maybe underestimated at first how difficult in practice this might be to abide by, and I think that there remains some very, very serious questions about what happens during the divestment window, which the current divestment window for any CCMCs that were on the list kind of originally is November of this year, and then it's 365 days after placement on the list. This whole, for those who aren't tracking, and we talked about this a little bit last time, this idea of close matches and having to deal with close matches and what that means, because there seems to be some conflicting guidance as to how you treat close matches to companies that are on the CCMC list, and that is really creating a lot of confusion. Not surprisingly, there's really nothing quite like that in the OFAC world. Now, in other screening contexts, obviously, you have to deal with that, obviously, but this is really creating a lot of confusion. What happens with non-US subs? What happens with US people who are working for non-US companies? What happens with other kinds of investments, options contracts and futures contracts and things like that that don't seem to be squarely addressed by the guidance and the text of the EO. So I think the only thing I really want to say here, and the only question I really want to pose to you is, I think we had presumed to date this is sort of a framework and a executive order that the incoming administration would probably keep. They might modify, but they would probably keep. What do we think now? Do we think now that there's maybe, given that there, I don't want to say some cracks showing, but there's obviously, I think this is not sort of being rolled out or implemented in a t sort of terrifically smooth manner, in part because this is a very unorthodox program. It is something that is not like anything else really in the OFAC portfolio. So what do we think the prospects are that this just gets scrapped or changed substantially? That there's a new EO that comes in to supersede, and there's something totally different that we see here. How do we handicap that at this point?
Well, it's such a mess, and so I do think that it's going to have to be cleaned up. And to start with this close matches, I think that problem, because I've given a lot of thought to that problem strikes me as one that kind of stems from the way that this program was created. So generally, when there's a treasury program, OFAC creates the list and then enforces the list through rules that we all kind of, at least the sanctions nerds, understand. There's screening software that is designed to catch, listed parties, and there is the 50% rule that people can understand. This program started with a list created by the Department of Defense. And the list at the time it was created had very minimal consequences, certainly no sanctions consequences when the list was created. And so and I think you pointed this out on one of the earlier episodes, Brian, but that list was very imprecise. So it had things like Huawei, which doesn't mean anything as a corporate matter. It just says Huawei on it. From an OFAC perspective, you don't know what to do with that because there is no match. If you're dealing with Huawei International Limited at a precise address and you're looking at a list that just says Huawei, there's no match, but it's a close match because you're dealing with a Huawei entity. And so they created a program from a list that OFAC didn't create, and based on that, they had to go through and try and figure out a way to essentially modify that list to work for a treasury program. And so I think it started from kind of a stupid place and has led to a lot of confusion. And I think they're going to need to really go back and fix it and really think about this a little bit more carefully than they did when they put this order out. And they may decide that they want to use some form of this program, but I don't think it's going to be kind of this slapped together mix of principles from multiple agencies that aren't usually used to working together.
Yeah, I mean the other thing is, no, I think that's right, and they have tried to kind of clarify the list so far, and there were promises of a lot more coming. There have been other um, signals and other sort of pronouncements out there about if what happens with subsidiaries and affiliates, and there was a State Department had a list of affiliated companies that they put out at some point, which created even greater confusion for people, and so. Yeah, I think we have to keep our eye on that. The other thing I would say too, to keep in mind here, is that because of the nature of these restrictions and because of the nature of the global financial system, I mean we have gotten, and I'm sure for most trade nerd counselors, I've gotten questions from all corners of the earth about this because people, if you run across an entity that's a close match or an actual match, and you say, well, wait, I got a question from a client I won't say the country, but in a country where they were asked, it's headquartered in that foreign country, and the question was sort of, are you a U.S. person for purposes of this order? Can we still deal with you if we're clearing trades and doing these other things? And there's a lot that's already been said about that and what U.S. persons can do and can't do, but I think it is just creating such confusion. And I think what we have seen in the past and what we are seeing now is as soon as the players in the financial sector, especially outside the US, get spooked and get worried that they're going to be potentially on the hook for causing a violation or for themselves perhaps getting into some kind of legal or regulatory trouble, then they just try to run as far as they can in the opposite direction. And because the gray area here is so large and kind of poorly defined at this point, I think that's what we're seeing right now. And it's just a lot of confusion and a lot of that. And so for any of you out there who are wrestling with this, trying to understand what it means, don't feel bad if you're confused. Many folks in the U.S. who spend a lot of time thinking about this, not just ourselves, many others are, I think, have their own views, but they have not quite been confirmed, validated, or clarified with OFAC at the moment. So we're hopeful that at some point in the next few months there will be some clarifications if there's not a full kind of reset on this program. But in any event, I think this has just become even more clear in the past few weeks that this is one that needs some help, I think.
Along with the International Criminal Court program, this is one where the order is so weird that they're going to have to do something about it. Although this, I think, but for what the Trump administration did, this is not an issue that the Biden administration would have been interested in really wading into, but for the fact that they've got to do something because these programs are so odd and not very well thought out.
Yeah, and again, a key thing to remember, as we have said, and we said on the last episode, and we say a lot, the underlying concerns from a policy or national security standpoint, not necessarily in dispute or controversial. The idea that the U.S. is concerned about civil military fusion in China, that the U.S. sort of either U.S. technology being stolen or sort of sent to China, and U.S. funds being funding that effort in some way, direct or indirect, not that controversial. That's kind of a pretty bipartisan, cut and dry issue. The means and the methods to address that, very, very different. And so I agree with Tim that I don't think we would have seen something like this from a Biden administration if this was really being kicked around 6 months ago or a year ago. But we'll see. Now that it's there, we'll see whether they keep it, whether it goes, or whether it gets modified in some substantial way, which I think is certainly a possibility. So we'll stay tuned on that. All right, so final two topics. So or let's turn now back to last fully China topic, which is Taiwan and the South China Sea. And I'll throw it back to Tim for that.
So, to continue on our theme, these are two real hot points in terms of diplomatic relations between the U.S. and China. With respect to Taiwan, the U.S. has watched what happened in Hong Kong, and I think there is significant concern that China will try to do the same thing with respect to Taiwan. And so Taiwan has become a hotspot issue, largely, I think, related to what happened in Hong Kong. The South, and also related to what's happening in the South China Sea. I mean, China is essentially trying to establish dominance and almost exclusivity over part of the South China Sea. It's building islands in what otherwise was just international waters, and then claiming territory, and then claiming the domestic shoreline around those islands, which really is reducing the size of the South China Sea that is international waters, or at least from a Chinese perspective, it's doing that. And both of those policies are sufficiently controversial that I don't think there's any dispute that the U.S. has interest in taking some form of action. What the U.S. did with respect to Taiwan as the administration wound down was to essentially change the rules with respect to Taiwan, because on the one hand, there's the concern for Taiwan's autonomy, for lack of a better term. On the other hand, there's the recognition that this is a dispute mostly between China and Taiwan, and while we're interested in that dispute being resolved peaceably, we also recognize that it's in China's interest as well China actually has legitimate foreign policy interests related to Taiwan that it should be working out peacefully with Taiwan. So what the U.S. had done previously was essentially tried to stay out of that and tried to not antagonize China. And there were certain policies that it took with respect to Taiwan that were designed to essentially stay out of the dispute between Taiwan and China. And the administration, as it wound down, took actions to try and wade back into that dispute in terms of, recognizing various aspects of Taiwanese autonomy that previous administrations had really stayed away from. South China Sea, what's happening, and it wasn't just at the end of the Trump administration, it was really within the past year, but there were some big actions that were taken at the end. We were making, the Commerce Department was making entity list designations of entities that were taking actions in the South China Sea to further Chinese policy to essentially reclaim or claim some of those waters as their own. And the most recent, and I think was the biggest, was that the Chinese national offshore oil company CNOOC was placed onto the entity list near the end of the Trump administration, based, according to the designation, on its actions in the South China Sea. But obviously, CNOOC is much, much bigger than that. And so that designation in particular has a huge consequence in the U.S., particularly in the oil and gas industry. And I assume you are, because I know that I am seeing a lot of questions about what happens now that CNOOC is on the entity list. And so, another area where there's legitimate foreign policy disputes going on, and that the Biden administration is likely to agree on the general policy with the Trump administration, but the mechanics in terms of how to address it, there was a lot of kind of shouting and kind of breaking things on the way out in both of those areas, but not a lot that is likely to have changed China's behavior or policy towards Taiwan or the South China Sea.
Yeah, I think just a couple very quick points on that. So I think with the South China Sea, we talked about this a few months ago when there were the first kind of wave of entity listings that were related to conduct in the South China Sea. CNOOC is a continuation of that. As Tim said, I think that's probably the most significant one thus far. I think we're going to see more action there, both with entity listings. It's possible that um, there could be some sanctions related actions that are being that the new administration decides to take with respect to that. I'm not exactly sure on what grounds yet, or maybe we could see a new program that's targeted at that. I don't know. We will see. But I think that is going to continue to be a big issue and sort of maybe rise up the priority list in terms of the China hot button issues. With respect to Taiwan, I mean, this was, if anything, is just sort of a bald-faced attempt to antagonize China, kind of normalizing relations with Taiwan or scrapping the decades-old, contacts policy that the U.S. government has with respect to Taiwan, which is what the Secretary of State did about 10 days before the end of the administration, is a great example of that. And there was purported to be an in-person meeting that was going to happen between a U.S. official and a Taiwanese official, and then I think there was uproar after that, and that got scrapped, and there was a telephone call or something thereafter. But I mean, that was just a pretty clear antagonistic move to try to set China on edge. And the interesting question will be, what does the Biden administration do? What does the incoming Secretary of State do? Do they revert back? Probably not, because I mean, they may actually take this one and sit on it as a piece of leverage and say, if there's going to be some negotiations at some point with China relating to trade or other things, this I'm sure will be a talking point. Will come up in those bilateral talks. I don't know that it's something that will just be given away for free. So in all likelihood, it may very well kind of stay undone, but perhaps not be observed. That would be my suspicion, but we'll see. But again, I think this is just another in the sort of in the tit for tat that the U.S. has been trying to play with China for the last few years in particular. I think this is just another example of that, and again another sort of provocative move that was designed to really just make make China furious, and I think mission accomplished. And we'll see what happens based on the public statements that were made, and we'll see what happens now once the new team is in at the State Department and fully has a chance to think through the repercussions of this and how they want to handle it. And so with that, we are we're coming to a close here. We got one topic left, final topic, and this one is it is broader than just China, although it is a lot about China, which is the on the last day of the Trump administration, the Commerce Department issued an interim final rule relating to securing the information and communications technology and services supply chain. So if you recall, this is the executive order that was issued in May of 2019. This is the same executive order that is cited as the underpinning and the authority for the WeChat and TikTok orders, the Alipay and WeChat Pay orders that we've spent a lot of time talking about. And so there was a proposed rule that got put out in late 2019 and a request for comments. And essentially, what is happening here for people who haven't, and I'm not going to go into this, we're not going to go into this in depth because I know that we will come back to this at some point. But to summarize in very broad strokes, because I think this is the first time we've really talked about it on the pod, is essentially what has happened here, what this interim final rule sets out is essentially an entirely new regulatory regime. It is sort of a CFIUS-like structure and regime that is now in place that allows the Secretary of Commerce to review certain information and communications technology and services transactions that impact the ICTS supply chain, and if they involve foreign adversaries. And the foreign adversaries are spelled out, and of course, the first two at the top of the list are China and Russia. It's China, Russia, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, and the Maduro regime. Not Venezuela, the Maduro regime. So six entities, six countries in all. And so obviously China, and then to a lesser extent Russia, I think are the top two here in terms of relevance and frequency with which these are going to be impacted. So this order, this interim final rule lays out this again, this regulatory regime where the Secretary of Commerce can review covered ICTS transactions. Again, covered transactions is sort of in the CFIUS vernacular, very similar. And there's a variety of criteria that have to be met to constitute an ICTS transaction that's capable of being reviewed. And if it's within the Secretary's power to review, it can be prohibited or mitigated or modified in some way, just as with CFIUS essentially. So this is a pretty big deal. No, make no mistake. Again, we're going to come back to this, so I'm not trying to get into it in too much detail. This is a big deal. There is also contemplated a licensing process by which parties to a particular ICTS transaction could seek a license to proceed with their transaction. There are no rules for that right now. They're promised to happen by May. Now, here's my question to you, Tim. With this in mind, the fact that this was literally dropped on the eve of the inauguration, it came out on January 19th. The effective date on this is 2 months off. This definitely falls within the scope of the regulatory freeze memo. I don't, so this will certainly be something that is going to get a lot of attention within the Commerce Department and elsewhere. And there was a request for comments from the public on the interim final rule in any event. So I know that there is going to be a lot of, I think, opportunity taken to voice concerns and criticisms of what is laid out here in the interim final rule. What do we foresee for this? Do we think that this is, again, this is a very kind of signature Trump administration effort, this ICTS supply chain executive order from last year. Again, underlying concerns, not controversial, means and methods of achieving those, perhaps up for a lot of debate perhaps. And so what do we think the likelihood is that we ultimately see something along the lines of this interfinal rule to get put in place? What were your just quick thoughts on what this interim final rule contained?
You know, so I definitely think that this idea is one that is likely to not be controversial. The idea that, we really ought to review our supply chains with respect to this sort of technology to make sure that, I mean, it's the Huawei issue, right? I mean, it's just writ large, which is that you've got these communications technology companies that essentially, to the extent they infiltrate the supply chain, they create opportunities for hostile governments to obtain data and obtain other information about U.S. persons and about the U.S. that they shouldn't have access to, or certainly we're worried that they're going to misuse. And so,
or to affirmatively sabotage critical U.S. infrastructure, which is the other side of the coin here.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a real problem. I think that it is a real problem that the U.S. government is concerned about. Whether housing that problem in the Commerce Department with CFIUS-like review powers is the right way to go about it, or whether there are other ways to go about it, I think that's really what the current administration, is going to think about for the next couple of months. I don't have strong feelings on where it comes out, although I do am inherently skeptical of complex ideas and complex policies like this coming out on the last day of an administration. And I assume the new administration will probably have that same amount of skepticism. But in reading through the new program, nothing jumps out at me where I can say that's wrong and that's crazy. It just seems like a very complex program put in without a lot of thought and without a lot of fanfare at the very end of an administration is one that I will, the more I think about it, the more likely I would be, I think, to find problems.
Yeah, I mean, look, there clearly was a lot of thought and time put into this, to, in a certain vein. But yeah, I agree that I think this is one there's probably too much at stake here, and this is too big of a problem to sort of leave to an 11th hour, rulemaking on this. And so I do think this is one that's going to get a very serious, fresh look, and where it comes out, I'm not sure. This is a good reminder to any of you out there who haven't looked at this to take a look at that interim final rule on the ICTS supply chain EO implementation of that. And if you want to make your voice heard, you have until at least until sort of late March. You have about 2 months, so plenty of time to sort of weigh in if you didn't weigh in the first time around. Now that it's a little more fully formed, so yeah, that's a really interesting one. I'm sure it's one we will be talking about again, but it'll probably be a few months before there's really more to report on that one. So okay, with that, we're wrapped. That is a lot of topics in just over an hour. That's pretty good for your intrepid long-winded hosts to cover that much ground in just over an hour.
I
So
would have guessed like
uh,
3 hours for 9 topics. I mean, it's pretty disappointing in a way.
it's 9 topics with like two or three subparts to each topic. So
Exactly.
we probably
Exactly.
covered about 20 different things. So
Yep.
again, there was a lot we left out. If anybody out there is listening and is interested in anything else from the last few weeks that we didn't cover, please shoot us an email or hit us up on Twitter or LinkedIn, where we're always posting about our new episodes when they go up. Happy to try to tackle that the next time. I think we are still hoping to potentially get some guests from other parts of the world to join us in coming episodes to weigh in on kind of what they're expecting and what the impact of the new administration may be from their perspective, what issues are most heavily weighing on their minds at the moment. I think that will be coming in the next month or so. We may very well be returning to sort of more of a traditional episode, depending on, you know, eh, who knows, because as these things go, if past holds, then something crazy will probably happen in the next like 48 hours, and then 2 weeks from now we'll be fixated on that. But that is our show for today, and we thank everyone for joining us. We hope everybody out there is staying safe. We hope you're wearing a mask now that that is mandated on federal property. We hope everyone is wearing a mask on federal property or otherwise. And until the next time, please stay safe and stay sanctions free.
Stay sanctions free, everybody. And looking forward to a very boring 2021.
Yeah, we'll keep our fingers crossed. All right, thanks everyone. Bye.